And so, you know, I was hoping we might start. I would love to just hear a little bit from both of you about how you're feeling right now. I mean, you know, what's on your hearts, what's on your minds. You know, Father Brian, I read your piece in the Catholic Reporter a few days ago entitled "The Assumptions of White Privilege and What We Can Do About It." And I was really struck by the first line that you wrote. And let me read it for people. "It has never been easy to be Black in America. Still, the past few months have pushed me to depths of outrage, pain, and despondency that are unmatched in my 63 years of life." Those are obviously very raw, very real words. I wonder maybe if you could start there, Father Brian, and talk a little bit about, you know, what you meant by that and just sort of what you're sitting with at this moment.
Thanks, John. Yeah, that opening really speaks to the context in which that essay, how it came about. People call me a progressive Catholic, but I'm very old school in my spirituality, I guess. And so I always keep a novena, the 9 days between Ascension and Pentecost, just really praying for the coming of the Spirit. And I really could not pray. I could not come to an inner peace of quiet. That Monday, if you remember, was the day that we had that horrible incident in Central Park, where, you know, an African-American man had the police called on him by a white woman who threatened him to do so simply because he had the gall to ask her to comply with the rules and leash her dog, knowing that she was exposing him to danger. And we couldn't even absorb that. And then later that afternoon, that very same day, the gruesome image of having George Floyd, you know, agonizing. I mean, agonizing as he's gasping for breath. And the crowd, you know, pleading with the officers to help him. And to watch that over and over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Just after the images of Ahmaud Arbery being shot down, hunted down, literally, as he's jogging through a neighborhood. And yes, that all moved me to this sense of, you know, how long do we have to continue to endure the humiliations and the terror that comes with being Black, brown, other in America? And so, yeah, that's where I've been, and where I'm now is this kind of whirlwind because folks like you want to talk to us, and I'm grateful for that. But I have to also be honest and say there's a part of me that wonders, where was all this attention before? Because again, as you said, this is not a new conversation. You know, we've been here before. You know, we've been here so many different times in our history. And so where I'm at now is, I'm tired, I'll be honest, but I'm also, you know, I'm just holding on to the hope that this is a moment, you know, we say in theology, a kairos moment, that this can really be a turning point. And yet I don't want to give too much weight to that hope because, again, as I said, we've been here before. And so now we have to see where this moment takes us. So that's where I'm at. That's how I'm doing.
Yeah, very much appreciate that. And it does feel like we've been here before. I mean, I remember when I was in high school during the Rodney King incident, and, you know, that was the beginning kind of the era where people were capturing these atrocities on camera. And so your point is well taken that we have been here before, and whether this is going to be sort of an inflection point moment or a kairos moment, as you call it, still remains to be seen. So I appreciate you kind of pulling back the camera and providing some context to that. Olga, what about yourself? I mean, what has it been like for you right now to sit with all of this as someone, who has written about this, who is a person of color, what has been on your heart and mind in these last few weeks?
Sure. So I find myself feeling a lot of what Brian just really was very eloquent about just now. I'm finding it very hard to sort of find this inner peace and just to be able to kind of get away from all of the turmoil and tragedy that we're seeing. One, because we process this, like Brian said, this isn't new to us. This is something that we've been processing our entire lives. This is something that our communities and our people have been dealing with for such a long time. But for me, the particular thing that I find that is new for me now is that, as Brian mentioned, many of us have been reporting and talking about this for years, but this is the first time where I'm forced to try to reconcile what it means to privately grieve with my community, privately grieve with my family at a time when we cannot physically be together, right? We have to rely on phone calls, we have to rely on Zoom. We can't actually, we are people, Black and brown Catholics are very much about being in physical community with each other. So what does it mean for me to try to grieve everything that's happening at a time when we can't be together, and at a time when, as Brian mentioned, I can't pray. I have not been able to bring myself to pray because it's so hard. It's very, very hard to try to process this. And then I'm dealing with all of these things privately, and then we also have all of these people who are coming to us for answers, and I'm just like, look, I don't have the answers. I don't have the answers because we're sad, we're anxious, we're paranoid that if, when my fiance goes out jogging, is he going to be harassed by the NYPD? These are things that we have to every single day think about in our lives, and it's just, it's hard. I find that it is a very, very hard time for so many of us. And anytime people try to ask, where do you find hope? I'm like, I don't think those are the right questions to be asking us. Just kind of listen to the sadness and the grief that we're going through.
Yeah, no, and I think your point too about the sadness and the grief coming at a moment when there's such social isolation makes it even harder. And, I think to your point too of communities of color that have, been thinking and not even thinking, but, dealing with this, the impact of this for many, many years. I think, that's really important for particularly white people like myself to hear. Part of white privilege, as you all know so well, is the ability not to have to think about this stuff. And, I find, I'm someone who's tried to, learn as much as I can about the history of the United States, but I will never know what it means to be a person of color in this country. And, I would say most of my friends and colleagues are obviously, progressive people of faith who want to be mindful and sensitive to these issues. But I do have white friends who, will say things like, I don't know what to do, or, slavery happened a long time ago. And just, these sort of these statements that really, I think, reflect kind of an ignorance that you can only have if you are in a privileged position. So I appreciate you raising that. Brian, I wanted to ask you, I know you saw this earlier in the week, that Pope Francis came out with a pretty strong statement, and he said, we cannot tolerate or turn a blind eye to racism and exclusion in any form, and yet claim to defend the sacredness of every human life. So, he was clearly framing racism there as a life issue, which is, as so important in the church in terms of how we think about justice issues, and what gets missing from that equation sometimes, unfortunately. I guess I wanted to ask you, first, what was your reaction to what the Pope said and how he said it? And the second part of that question would be, why do so many white Christians have trouble seeing racism as a life issue, do you think?
Okay. Let me preface this by saying that one of the new moments, I think, because of the urgency, is that I find myself having less patience with trying to frame things in ways that people can find easier to digest. So I'll just simply say, when Pope Francis said what he said, I said, finally, at last, finally, at last, someone in high authority has been saying what people of color, again, in a Catholic Church have been saying for a long time, and that is that racism is a life issue. And as I pointed out in my essay, Pope Francis isn't being just a liberal Francis Pope, as people like to say. He was actually echoing things that Pope John Paul II had said back in the 1990s in his last pastoral visit to the United States, when I think it was in 2001, when he said that that he called on Catholics to be unconditionally pro-life. And I think, to go to your second part of your question, which is really the nub of the issue in the Catholic Church, is that for too long in the Catholic Church, we've framed concerns of pro-life around the very narrow meaning of being anti-abortion. And therefore, we've been willing to give basically a pass to any politician's other issues across the spectrum, no matter what their issues were on education or healthcare access or criminal reform, or criminal justice reform, or mass incarceration. None of that mattered as long as they were willing to rhetorically say something that was consistent with being anti-abortion and promise to appoint judges who would reflect that conviction. And so we've had this, support for politicians who supported policies that were very, detrimental to the lives of people of color. But as long as they were okay on the anti-abortion piece, then that they only got a pass. In many cases, they got, Catholic approval. Catholic approval. Let me be, again, John, you've struck a nerve here, but I need to be honest here. I remember that there was a time when I could not speak in certain dioceses simply because I said that a Catholic could be a good Catholic and vote for President Obama. And cannot, deceive ourselves that there were many Catholic leaders and bishops who aligned themselves vociferously against Obama simply because he couldn't pass their narrow interpretation of being anti-abortion. And so when Pope John Paul called for us to be unconditionally pro-life, for Pope Francis to say that no, you cannot turn a blind eye to racism and claim that you are protecting or advancing the sacredness of human life. I said, about time, that it's high time that we start, this fiction that we can be, racist and support policies that are detrimental to the lives of people of color and yet call ourselves pro-life. Because that is the biggest reason why many Catholics will support the current president who's caging brown children at the border and yet say this is pro-life. Finally, Pope Francis rips that veil, that veneer of rationalization away. And I think that that's something that we're going to have to keep coming back to over and over in this election season, unfortunately.
Totally agree with you. I really hope, more bishops begin to embrace this kind of language too. It was unfortunate, at least from my perspective, to see when the bishops voted on their election year guide, Faithful Citizenship, back in the fall. Abortion was signaled out as sort of the preeminent issue for Catholics, and we could have a whole nother Facebook Live conversation about that issue.
Back to another conversation about that. Yes.
We'll save that for another time. That's complicated, but the need to uplift the consistent ethic of life, revive that tradition on our church is needed more than ever before, particularly now. Olga, I wanted to ask you, you're writing a book about Black Lives Matter movement and the Catholic Church, which is going to be fascinating to read. And, can you talk a little bit about why you wanted to write this book and maybe some key points that you've learned through your research and your writing on it?
Sure. So the main reason I wanted to write this book is because I've been covering the Black Lives Matter movement for a few years and really sort of focusing on the ways in which it intersects with what it means to be a faithful person in the United States. And I think, as Brian mentioned, in the church, when we talk about what it means to be pro-life, it is more often than not always associated with being anti-abortion. And to me, this movement and these activists fully embody the gospel, fully embodying what it means to care for the dignity of human beings, to care for the poor, for the marginalized, to they should demonstrate what it means to be in solidarity with each other. So I was really, after so many years of seeing this myself, I really wanted to just highlight that for Catholics, because I think there's one of the biggest criticisms I see of the movement is that, well, you know, a lot of these activists are gay activists or they're pro-choice and we shouldn't be allowed to be in dialogue with them. But I think that as Catholics, we're doing a disservice to ourselves and our church when we say we're pro-life but are unwilling to sit with the most significant civil rights movement since the 60s, you know? So I really wanted to kind of show people in our church and sort of help them restructure what they mean when they say that they are pro-life. Because you mentioned, John, that the bishops voted on this document and said that abortion was the preeminent issue. And as a person of color, I read that and I'm looking around thinking, people are getting shot in the street. People are in cages, as Brian mentioned, and you still can't get off this abortion hill. So I really wanted to kind of just highlight that, one, this movement shows perfectly what it means to care about not just Black life, but every life in this country, which so many people in our church claim that they care about. And I wanted to really just help Catholics to kind of begin to restructure the way that they talk about what it means to be pro-life. And I think one of the most interesting things that I'm finding in my own research is just learning about the faith lives and the traditions that have shaped so many activists in this movement. Like even one of the women who founded the movement, she grew up in a very faithful community, and that informs the work that she does, even though she's not in the church anymore, you know? And I wanted to just highlight all of this for Catholics and say, hey, if you care about social justice, if you care about life, then you have to align yourself with this movement.
And just, Olga, so people know, when will your book be available? When will it be out?
Well, assuming I hand in my manuscript at the end of this month, it will be published next year by Orbis, so spring 2021.
Okay, great.
I'm so happy. I'm so happy, Olga. That's going to be wonderful. I can't wait to read it. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Brian, because
likewise,
I bet your book is, if you hadn't written your book, I would have found it very hard to write my book in 2020. So thank you. That means a lot.
Well, well, we could have this mutual love affair going on for a while. but no, I think it's just wonderful to see someone who's young and energetic, you know, adding her voice to this ongoing struggle. So I'm just absolutely thrilled. So
thank you. Thank you.
Brian, I wanted to ask you, I mean, you've been, you know, probably the most respected scholar in the Catholic Church on racial justice issues for a while now. You've been doing this a long time. You've been speaking out, you've been writing, you've been an activist, you know, for decades. I'm curious, you know, with your long view on all this, and I know that big picture, tough question, and this is what's great about being a moderator. I just get to ask the questions. I don't actually have to come up with good answers. But, you know, what, because I've been on the other end too, you know, what mistakes do you see, you know, Catholic leaders, whether they're bishops or clergy, and even well-intentioned folks, right? People who want to get it right on race. What mistakes do, you know, white Christian leaders, white Catholic leaders, whether they're bishops or clergy or women religious, what kind of mistakes do they make talking about race? And I don't know if mistakes is even the best word, perhaps it is, but I feel like, you know, many white Christians who are well-intentioned want to do this well, but end up not getting it right. And I wonder, you know, given your long experience on this issue and writing about it and reading it and living it, are there some mistakes that you see people making that you can talk about that could help get us to a better type of conversation around these issues?
Wow. Where to start? I would say, let me enter the question by talking about the question that people most often ask me after I give a lecture or a presentation or a workshop dealing with these topics. And sooner or later, someone in the Q&A will ask a question that goes like this. Father, how can we talk about this in my church, in my parish, in my classroom, on my campus, and do it in a way that doesn't make white people uncomfortable? And whenever they ask that question, I say, okay, let's pause. I'm asking all of our people who are on this with us now to pause and think about that question. Why is it that the only group that's never supposed to feel uncomfortable in discussions about race are white people? The presumption is that we should be able to talk about this issue in such a way that white people are never made to feel uncomfortable and can leave the conversation at the end of the day to feel good about themselves. And that's the biggest mistake that I think the Catholic Church has made, in that it's not true to say that the Catholic Church has said nothing and done nothing. But what the Catholic Church has said and done is always predicated upon the comfort of white people and not to disturb white Catholics. And if you make that your overriding presumption and goal, then there are going to be difficult truths that will never be spoken, and we will never have an honest conversation. Because we have to face the fact, and this is what I tried to get in my essay, is that the only reason why racism still exists is because it benefits white people. And there is no comfortable way of saying that. As I keep telling people, do you think honestly that I or Olga or any of our family members and friends want to live in a world where we have to explain to our brothers how to conduct themselves when they're walking on the street? We don't want to live in that world. If it were up to us, that world would have vanished a long time ago. So the only reason it exists is because of white benefit, or another way of putting it, white fear. But again, we can't say that too directly, because I can hear your listeners already, because I get emails all the time telling me that this is the part of the essay they really stumbled over. And yet I have to say that this is the biggest mistake that we make, is that we presume that there is a way to deal with this that doesn't really disturb the status quo enough to make people uncomfortable. And as long as we have that, we're going to have, for example, the 2018 Racism Pastoral Letter, which is a perfect exhibit in point about how to talk about race and not to disturb white people. Because when white people appear, they appear as people who have done the right thing, that they've been saviors. The word white privilege doesn't appear in the document. The Black Lives Matter movement, you never would have known it happened by reading the document because it doesn't appear. They acknowledge that there are some people of color who have negative experiences with the police. They never talk about systemic police misconduct. And they share their harshest words of condemnation. The only time the word condemn appears in the whole document is when they condemn negative rhetoric directed toward police officers. So again, the biggest mistake, and there are many others, but they all are derivatives of this fundamental one, and that is people's presumption. Indeed, I think in some ways their demand that there be a way in which we talk about these issues that don't make white people uncomfortable. I can even tell you about going to one diocese to give a workshop on race, and the bishop took me aside before the workshop began, and he said, I want you to say something that's going to be effective. I mean, I don't want people to get really, I don't want them to be too disturbed now. Well, I said, you can't do that. And I think that, John, is the biggest mistake that we make. Because it also, in addition to not becoming honest, it also means that we have to discount, minimize the real discomfort, the real injustice, the real fear that people of color feel every day living in this climate of racial injustice. And so I think, that's the biggest mistake that we make as Catholics, the presumption, the demand even, that this conversation take place in a way that doesn't make white people uncomfortable.
I really appreciate that. And that's something, the last couple of years I've sat with as I've done this kind of work and learned from people like you and Olga and colleagues, particularly I would say kind of younger colleagues I've had who have pushed me to look at this more, in a way that recognizing that my comfort level is not important, right? And so I think that's a really good point. I also think too it's cautionary note to make for those of us and I'm speaking as a white person here, is sort of progressive white folks who think they kind of and they don't, right? And so that's really important. And post Obama becoming the first African president, I think there was this general societal feeling among some white liberals that, well, okay, we've reached this point of kind of racial
this post-racial society, right? I remember all of that.
Yeah.
We turned the corner. We've got a new page here and things like that. But it was interesting you talked, because just this week and everything else, the Tablet, the Catholic newspaper based out of London, asked me to write explain for an international audience what's going on in the United States in 900 words or less. And I'm like, oh, okay. But one of the things I pointed out is that you cannot understand the current moment we're in without understanding the Obama presidency. Because we have to remember that Obama in both presidential elections, in neither one did he carry the support of the majority of white voters. He won because of overwhelming support from communities of color and by sufficient support from a minority of white voters. And since his election, especially after his re-election, there has been a concerted effort from some whites to use their slogan, to take back our country. And to do that through restrictive voter ID laws, through restricting access to the polling place by restricting voting hours, by restricting reducing the number of sites in Black and brown communities. We've had all kinds of ways in which people are trying to turn back the clock. And so to look at the Obama presidency as being this major step forward, I also have to say that it's been a catalyst for the significant, as one person said, a significant white lash that we've had to the fact that we had the temerity to elect a person of color to the nation's highest office.
Yeah, that's very well said. I've done I've thought a lot about that too. To your point, Brian, we have a white nationalist in the White House in large part because we had 8 years of African American president. Those two things are not unrelated. So that backlash is very prominent, and we're still seeing it. Olga, I wanted to turn to you. You wrote a piece in America magazine recently that was really good, and you said, and that sure provide. We saw.
You're breaking there, John, a little bit. So could you repeat your question?
Yeah, I couldn't hear you.
I'm sorry.
No worries.
Okay, and I apologize again for the technical problems. Olga, you wrote in America magazine recently, and let me quote from the piece because I thought it was very good. Imagine the beautiful symbol of accompaniment the church provide if we saw priests and religious in collars standing in solidarity with activists whom President Trump has tarred as thugs, demanding that our country be a better place for Black Americans. And I think that was really well said. I should note, we did see a powerful gesture from Bishop Seitz of El Paso earlier this week, where he kneeled with other clergy with a Black Lives Matter sign. And he actually Bishop Seitz had a great piece in NCR Today. I don't know if you're all able to see it, where he said, he quoted from James Cone, the Black liberation theologian. As James Cone put it, Bishop Seitz wrote, in America, the word comes tortured, Black, and lynched. Today we meet Jesus in those tear gassed and strangled. So Olga, I was interested in that point you made about the need for priests and other religious leaders to be out there with activists. And I wanted to get your thoughts on why that is so important in your mind, and then what would that look like specifically for you?
Yeah, so I'm going to borrow, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember exactly what you said a little while ago, Brian, but I'm at the point where when I think about what it means to be an ally, it's not enough to just, as so many corporations and magazines have been doing this week, it's not enough to just say Black Lives Matter, because unfortunately, that is what we were demanding 7 years ago. Now it's 2020. We are seeing the rise of very extreme violence all over the country. So for me, being an ally now means physically putting your body on the front lines for these people, because Black and brown activists, Black people have been fighting this fight since this country first forced them into slavery 400 years ago. So when I say, imagine how powerful it would be, I'm really calling people to do exactly what the bishop from El Paso did. Put yourself on the line, because unfortunately, there are a lot of people in our church who are going to look at Brian, who are going to look at me, and they're not going to listen to anything that we are saying because of the way that we look. So when you have bishops who go to the line, who go to the front lines, and who hold Black Lives Matter signs, that's not for us. When I want them to do that, it's because I know that there are white Catholics in our church, and white Christians more broadly, we're going to look at him and follow in his example. So when I say, white allies, you need to put your bodies on the line, this is what I mean, because unfortunately, this is the way our church works, right? A lot of people might disregard what the bishops do. A lot of people might disregard what other church leaders do, but it says a lot to have someone at the line and saying, hey, this is what it means to live out the gospel. This is what it means to align yourself with this struggle. And I think that I love that bishop was there, but that was the bare minimum. Like, I still want to see more bishops. I want to see more priests. The nuns, yes, I want to see them too, but they've been doing a lot of work that goes unnoticed for years. And I think it's really important to actually concretely show what it is to be an ally. Because like Brian said, I'm tired of these statements. I'm tired of these pastoral letters. I'm tired of these statements that come out 5 days later, and we all read it and are furious yet again because they're so unwilling to be courageous. So I think that literally leaving whatever tower a lot of these bishops live in and going to the front lines and putting themselves there, I think it's a significant move for the church to do right now. And I think it's extremely important because the onus has to be on white Catholics and white leaders.
If I can follow up on that, Olga, that's a great point. The other reason why it's really important to have those visible leaders in their collars, wherever they're there, is because it shows that this is a religious and a spiritual challenge. This is not simply a political issue. And that was something that the civil rights movement really taught us. That one of the reasons why it was as successful as it was is because it spoke with moral authority. That yes, racism is a political issue, but it's also a moral issue and a religious issue. And when bishops show up, not to take over, but when they show up to be there and in solidarity, what they're showing and giving witness to is that, you know, this is something that is important, a key element of Catholic faith. And they're saying that you cannot be a good Catholic and not be concerned about what's happening here. And the only, racism poses profound challenges to the soul. And we're ever going to get beyond this. I mean, we need laws, we need change educational access, we need a lot of things. But we're not going to succeed unless people really do the deep down soul work of conversion and transformation. And when bishops and priests and show up in their paraphernalia and they're obviously, you know, that's when it becomes, because we Catholics, we like visuals, we like sacraments and stuff. We show people that this is a religious challenge. This is a spiritual challenge. This isn't about being red or blue or Democrat or Republican. This is about what does it mean to be a Christian in America today.
Right. And when we talked about, and I don't just want to say this last thing for this, and when we talked about earlier, the need to kind of restructure what we mean as a church, what we say when we mean we're pro-life, seeing a bishop at the front line, seeing a bishop in protest, this is a part of what it is to be a pro-life church. And I think if we're going to be a church that doesn't just associate being anti-abortion with being pro-life, if we want a church to show that it aligns itself, that being pro-life means caring about Black lives, I think this is one of the ways to do it as well.
Absolutely, because as we know, bishops have not been shy about attending the March for Life. They've not been, shy about, praying in front of, abortion clinics. Then I would like to see bishops go to the places, the shrines that we've erected where Black lives and Black bodies have fallen and lead a rosary there. That would be wonderful.
I agree with all of those points. I think, words and statements can only go so far. And, I think about what Pope Francis talks about, the need for us to be a church in the streets. And one of the things that I believe this was 95 years ago, I can't remember, I think it was one of the most powerful things that bishops have done, and they should do more of it. And I think they could really learn from Pope Francis, who uses gestures and symbols so well, is went to the border law, and they were communion through the slabs of the border. I mean, that just being there and showing, to all of your points, the presence, and walking with people and walking behind people, right? Not walking in front, but being a servant leader. So I appreciate all of those points. Brian, I wanted to ask you.
Before you ask your question, I want to just piggyback on this and to say something that's really important, and that is our focus on bishops isn't, I don't want to do that in a way that reinforces a clericalism in the church, because or to excuse those who are not bishops and priests, from their own responsibility of witness as well. And I point that out because at Charlottesville, there was a famous picture of clergy leaders leading at one of the protest marches. And when I show that picture, I asked them to look at that picture and to identify the Catholic clergy person, the Catholic priest that's in the photo. And so they make stabs at it. They obviously exclude the women because they know the Catholic Church doesn't do that yet. But then I tell them, well, one, it's a trick question because there is no Catholic priest present there. There were no Catholic clergy. However, there was a Catholic layman there, a man named Eric Martin. And when they asked for Catholic clergy, and he told them, that there weren't any there, they gave him a stole and put it on him. They said, because you're the Catholic representative here. And so you see that picture there, and you see this young white man, Eric Martin, with this stole around his neck. And what he does is he's claiming his baptismal identity as being baptized into the priestly office of Christ. And I think that's incumbent upon all of us. I mean, yes, our bishops need to be present, and yes, they bear a unique symbolism and unique responsibility, but I don't want that to dismiss the possibilities and the need for lay activism and lay leadership. We don't need to wait for the bishops to do what we know is right.
Amen to that. I totally agree with you. We can get sometimes, particularly those of us who write about the church, and we can get sometimes bishop-centric. So that is a really important thing. So this question is for both of you, and Brian, maybe we could start with you. So it's obviously hard to have a conversation about race and racism right now without talking about the election that's going to be taking place in a few months. And there was a really interesting piece. I don't know if both of you saw it, but there was an interesting piece in the Washington Post yesterday from a leading scholar of Christian nationalism. His name is Andrew Whitehead of Clemson University. And he's got a book out looking at Christian nationalism. And he wrote this. He said, while Christian nationalism clearly draws on religious symbols, Bibles and churches, for instance, our work also shows that it is strongly associated with authoritarian control, militarism, nativism, and white supremacy. So, I mean, given that observation that we see very clearly, particularly right now, and the fact that more than half of white Catholics voted for President Trump in 2016, what can we do to help Catholic leaders and voters really recognize the role that racism and white backlash plays in this president's political agenda? I have, most of my friends and family are progressive and liberals, but I do have that one family member who is a good Catholic. She is my godmother. She is one of the, greatest people that I know. She's a nurse. but she voted for Trump, mainly for the one issue we were talking about earlier, abortion, and trying to engage, those people that we care about, or perhaps even people we don't know, to kind of open their eyes to the fact that probably the biggest reason this president was elected, and this is not an opinion, it's what kind of the political science research shows, is this kind of, racially laden Christianism. What can we do to kind of make sure that Catholic leaders and voters see that, so it's not pushed to the side? I know that's a big question, but I wonder, Brian, if you might have a few thoughts on that.
That is a huge question, and if this were academic context, I would go into an extended history of how the Christianity and whiteness became conflated, but I don't think that's very helpful for right now. I'm going to take it to the question, the frame that you gave it in terms of how do you reach that really good person who can't see it, and for reasons of faith. And I think we people who are progressives or call ourselves progressives, whatever that means. I just think it means being a good Christian, frankly. We need to use the tools and resources of our faith as skillfully as other folks do. And one of the things that and I'm teaching at Jesuit University, about Ignatian composition of place. And so to encourage your godmother to imagine how she would feel if her son, her daughter, her children were forcibly separated from her and she could not see them. And the reason why I'm saying it is this. Back before I wore a collar, I worked in store security at a retail store. And we had a certain code or procedure that would happen in case there would be a lost child. And parents would come to us in panic because their kid was lost in the store. They didn't know where their kid was. And so we had this code, this procedure that we did. And the joy, the relief, you can see people begin to breathe again when you reunite them with their kid, and that anxiety is there, and the kid was only gone for a matter of minutes. Now ask your family member to imagine what it's like to be shipped across the border out of the country, and you have no idea where your kid is, and your kid has no idea where you are. And to just sit in that agony, to sit in that desolation. I can't imagine what it's like to be a parent and to even contemplate that. When we use the tools of our contemplative traditions, whether it's Ignatian or Carmelite or whatever, and have people dwell there, that's when you have affect and faith meeting. And that gives us the tools, the possibility for a breakthrough that won't happen if you try to engage them with talking points. Because the thing with talking points is the other side is their talking points to respond to your talking points. I mean, that's how it works. The only way we can do this is by facilitating a conversion, and the way we do that is to say, how would you feel if your child was lost in a department store? Or imagine the fear of your child being abducted, and now magnify that by having your child be hundreds, thousands of miles away. And what is it doing to that kid who is now sitting in a cold cage without a blanket, not even comprehending the language, and just live there? I think, John, the answer to your question is that we need to be as savvy, if you will, with using the tools of our faith tradition to speak a faith language that can counter the narrative of Christian nationalism.
I love your point that it's not about talking points. And I think what you're talking about, Brian, at least how I'm hearing it, is kind of a movement from, and this is not, converting people is not an intellectual exercise. It's not, to your point, kind of a litany of talking points or data. How do we create kind of an awakening of empathy to be able to, even if you can't fully understand what it's like to be a person of color or immigrant that's been taken from their family, how do you have that sort of heart experience? And some of that, I think, is putting yourself in proximity and being with people, who are experiencing that, because it's hard, I think, to really have that sort of transformation or awakening of empathy if you're just talking about this as kind of an issue and not, the reality that people are living. So I really appreciate that point from moving kind of from the head to the heart. Olga, what about you? Again, I know that's a big question that we're talking about here, but what do you think about that?
Sure. So I want to piggyback off of Brian a little when he was talking about we have the tools in our faith. We have the tools to do this right. We know what it is to be people who have been shaped by Catholic social teaching. We know what it means to be a good Christian. And I think not just turning to the tools into our tradition, but also engaging with the work of Black and brown Catholics who have been doing this for years. And I don't mean send an email to Brian Massigel and ask him to explain to you how to not be racist or how to unlearn your white privilege. I mean, sitting with the work that's already out there. Sit with Massingel's work. Sit with the work of Shannon D. Williams, Nicole Flores, Anthea Butler. Sit with the work of people who for years have already been creating content that explicitly highlights what it means to be a person of color, what it means to be a Catholic in this church and in this time. So I think that's point number one. If you want to talk about what it means to encounter and learn and educate yourself, first sit with the work that people are already doing and really sit with it and grapple with your own privilege and be okay with that discomfort. And two, one thing that I've been noticing a lot this time around that I don't think happened a lot more before, I'm seeing a lot of public acts of accountability on social media. I see people donating to specific funds and then screenshotting it and sharing it. And one thing that's been happening in the Catholic world is I have a lot of people who have sent me lists, Google spreadsheets or Google Docs saying, hey, I'm in the Archdiocese of New York, for example, and here are all the parishes who said things about racism, and here are all the parishes that did not. What do you want me to do with it? And I keep telling people, I'm like, keep talking about that. Keep publicly saying, like, this parish spoke about this parish did this well, or this parish did this poorly. Because I think, yes, we don't want to give into the polarization that can happen on social media and start trolling one another and be malicious, but I think we can hold each other accountable. If you see that your priest has not mentioned race once this month or in May, talk to him about it, call him out and say, hey, here are the people who are doing this, here are the people who are doing this well, and do that work. Again, it's just about white Catholics doing the work, and we have the resources, we have the people who have written about this, and just hold each other accountable. I think really hold each other accountable and don't expect us to give you the answers, because yes, we know you're an ally, we know you want to help. You don't need to tell us, because we know, like Brian said, if it were up to us, there would be no racism, So sit with that, hold yourselves accountable, engage with one another, support Black Catholics, support brown Catholics, like the work that they do, follow them on Twitter, buy their books, and really, really grapple with that. And I think, I keep going back to this, but I think there's something so powerful about people who are taking part in this protest movement and people who are going to the front lines, because I think I've seen a lot of white people. This is the first time that they've been harassed by police officers. We've been harassed by police officers our whole lives. And this is the first time that they're like, oh my God, what all of you have been saying is true, because I am a white person who was hit with a baton, or I am a white person who was arrested for peacefully protesting. That's why I think going to these places and encountering and putting your body on the line will really work to kind of shift the mentality that a lot of white Americans have. So those are 3 ways that I think we can really help people to realize that this country, if we don't act now, can get can get even darker than it already is right now.
And the other thing too is that to sit with the discomfort of being overwhelmed at the magnitude of the problem. Because one of the things I'm getting now is that people are saying, they're reading the NCR essay and they're saying, oh my God, I don't know what to do. It's like so overwhelming. And I said, yes.
That's what we
yes, you got it. Yeah. Or one person who wrote a very insightful email said, I feel like you're a professor in graduate school talking about this in a graduate school level. I'm still in middle school with all this. And I said, okay, but now you have to ask yourself the question, what allowed you to live most of your life so that you had a middle school understanding of racism? What allowed you to do that? Because again, that's not a luxury that, that the rest of us have. So the very fact that you could live your life, and this is a person who I know well and was in the mid-50s, could live, over 55 years of life in America and still only have a middle school understanding of race. That is part of the problem. And yeah, it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming for our Black and brown Catholics too, and for our Native brothers and our Asians, who really, it is overwhelming. But but that's not a reason to not engage it. It's not a reason to not engage it. Because when you realize it's overwhelming, then you're freed from the fallacy of looking for a quick, superficial, feel-good solution. You realize that that doesn't work. And I think that's, going back to something you asked earlier, John, what mistakes do we make? I think we always make the mistake that we get into these crisis moments and we're looking for, okay, what do we do? Like Governor Cuomo always says, okay, what are your policy wants? What do you want? Give us the 3 concrete acts of legislation that we can give that will, take away the problem. And we want to say, no, that yes, there are concrete things that need to be done, but realize that no one thing or 2 things or 3 things are going to do it. But that's not an excuse not to do anything. So yes, being overwhelmed is one of the first steps to get us out of the trap of looking for the quick fix. We're looking for the easy answer. And realizing that when we do this work, we're going to have to engage in a marathon. Or another way of putting it would be a relay race. And realize that, I'm, as I said in my essay, I'm 63 years old, so now everybody knows. Which means, I'm not going to live forever, which I realize now. Don't like to say it too long, but it means that I'm probably going to pass on before we reach whatever racial promised land we're coming to. But I do what I do for the sake of those who both went ahead of me, honor their work, and for those who are coming up behind me, people like Olga and so many others. And to realize that we have to think in terms of, not just what we need to be doing in here and now, there's so much we need to do in here and now, but to realize that it's going to be an intergenerational process, but we have to start now. We have to start now because people are dying now. People are being miseducated now. People are going hungry now. We need to start now.
On your point, Brian, about being sort of people saying they're overwhelmed, or white people saying they're overwhelmed by the problem, I realized we hadn't talked specifically during this conversation about police brutality and what, we as Catholics, Christians can do about that. Obviously, protest is one tool, getting out of the street. But when it comes to a problem that's so systemic and has been around for so long, how do you both think about that? And I don't know if you get this question from people, but okay, I'm a Catholic. I want to do the right thing. Police brutality, I see it. I know it's there. I do to make a difference. I think one thing is getting connected to social justice organizations that are working on that issue. But I'm curious, what do you both think about that? How can we have a conversation in the church about police brutality? I think, Brian, you may have mentioned earlier, the bishop's pastoral letter. on race that came out, there really wasn't much talk or any talk about police violence. And so how do we begin that conversation, and what are some specific things that we can do as Catholics to address that?
I'll start, maybe Olga, and then I think one of the things we need to do is we need to make a crucial distinction between supporting police officers and reforming the culture of policing. Because I think too often we get distracted by saying that if we criticize the police, then we're denigrating the good law-abiding officers. And I'm not saying no. I mean, Black and brown people live in communities that are plagued with crime. We want responsible policing, okay? I mean, this is not about saying, oh, we need to abolish police departments, no. But it does mean, and I talk as a moral theologian now, we give police officers a great deal of prudential discretion in the use of deadly force. And we do that in order to act for the public safety or the common good. We have a responsibility, therefore, to train them well so that they can make good prudential decisions in the use of lethal force. And we also have to have mechanisms that hold them accountable when they abuse that prudence or that discretion. And so we need to look at a couple of things. One, we need to revisit this doctrine of qualified immunity, which basically makes it almost impossible to convict a police officer of criminal charges when they misuse their authority in a lethal force incident. We need to also be aware of the power of police unions in terms of public financing and public influence on public officials. That many public officials don't want to run afoul of the police union precisely because police will say these people are being soft on crime or not supporting our police officers. Again, we need to be careful, make the distinction, support police officers, but there is a culture of policing which is profoundly broken in this country. Because during the Obama administration, the Department of Justice conducted over 24 investigations of police departments around the nation. This isn't just a New York City problem or Milwaukee problem or a Boise problem or Chicago problem or a Los Angeles problem. It's a national problem. And we have a national problem that points to the fact it's not simply rogue officers. There is a systemic problem here, and we have to address the culture of policing, and we need better guidelines to train our officers on the appropriateness of lethal force, when it's appropriate to use it, how to train people in de-escalation procedures, but then also create those mechanisms that can hold officers responsible when they abuse the discretionary prudence that we give them in the exercise of their authority.
Yeah, I really appreciate your point too, Brian, on the fact that we can separate individual officers between the systemic and cultural problem. I don't know if either of you saw Colonel Dolan's comment. I think it was on his radio show the other day, where he was really defending the police department, and in a way that I thought was kind of false equivalency, because he was talking about most cops are good. But he didn't really talk about the culture or the institution of policing, and it made me think about the parallels between the clergy abuse crisis, right? I mean, it was the clericalism and the institution and the culture that enabled a lot of this abuse. It's not to say that most priests are good priests, most cops may be good cops, but the institution is a problem, and the culture is a problem. So I think, thinking critically about that is really important, and it's a hard one. It's a hard mental leap, I think, for a lot of people to make. So I appreciate you raising that. Olga, did you have some thoughts on this as well?
Sure. So this is actually something that now that I'm 30, I'm trying to educate myself a bit more on what it means when what do we mean when we say we want to reform police officers, the police departments? What do we mean when we say we want to abolish police departments? Because I think that's part of the conversation that a lot of people who have been doing this work for much longer are, and I think I think this specific movement has made me more cynical about the police departments and a little more leaning toward what would it look like if we just had community-based policing and we had communities who had elders and clergy involved in the process of what it means to keep communities safe. So from that perspective, number one, I would say we have to educate ourselves. I think we have to learn about not just what we mean when we say responsible policing or police reform or abolish police. I think we have to educate ourselves and use that education to get involved locally. I know one thing that all of my friend groups are talking about, because a lot of them work in the Department of Education, a lot of them are teachers, or a lot of them work in administration. One of the things that they made me aware of was everyone is praising Cuomo and all these efforts that are happening during the pandemic, but he also made some major cuts to New York City public schools that are already extremely underfunded, but they just are about to, I think, approve this huge budget for the NYPD. So kind of getting involved locally and demanding that our local leaders, and I'm not going to do the whole like vote in November and this will solve racism. No. I think at the local level, show up to these meetings and ask people like de Blasio and Cuomo, who seem to be living in a New York City that's very different from the New York City we're in, and demand that they are transparent about how these departments get funded, why these departments get funded. And I think that that'll help us to begin to have conversations about what our police department should look like. I think a lot of the conversations that I have when people say, well, there are good cops. Yes, I'm not saying that police officers are evil. I don't want anything awful to happen to them, but they are a part of a system that has they've created a system where we have a society where you have someone like Dolan whose experiences only involve good cops. Then you have people in my family who we've never necessarily had great experiences with the cops, and we don't think about them as agents of protection, agents that are in service to us. So I think just educating ourselves, pushing back against this extreme funding that seems to be happening and this weird militarization that is happening in our cities, and just continuing to push back on that, because I think that we have to reimagine what it means to have a criminal justice system in this country, to have police forces, the prison industrial complex. Like, I think I personally am not educated enough, but I know that what we have now is not working. And I think we need to educate ourselves and demand that our local leaders are transparent about why they fund these departments that harass our communities. And I think those are two really good starting places to fight against police brutality.
I think another thing we need to throw into the conversation is the role of white fear in the public support for militarized, aggressive policing. We have to remember, because we're hearing the rhetoric of law and order again, that rhetoric was a direct reappeal to white fear. White fear of dark-skinned bodies that were being pictured as being out of control. And the way in which we control them is through aggressive policing and militarized policing, because militarized policing is not the norm in every community. Let's be clear about that. That there are many white suburban communities that don't understand what we mean by militarized policing, because they never see it. They never see it, and that it exists in a response to white fears. And so all the things we're talking about, Olga, are really important. I think, again, maybe it's because I'm a priest and I think about spirituality or something, but until white people examine the roots of their fears of dark-skinned people and ask themselves, why is it that when that's tapped, that they're willing to support these policies that have such detrimental effects on us, and it's because of fear. It really is because of fear. You see it even now in the debates over the violence that's supposedly going on. I mean, I really hate this conversation because, we fixate, on the burning buildings and the broken windows. And we don't look at, one, not all that violence is done by people of color. There's a whole lot of debate in terms of like who's actually doing this violence, in terms of who actually spray painted, St. Patrick's Cathedral. It wasn't, black or brown person. But I think it goes to a deeper question, that is, why is it that we're so concerned about the violence that's done to buildings, but we've been so apathetic about the violence that's been inflicted upon Black and brown bodies and Black and brown communities for so, so long.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that that's an important conversation because it goes to this root of white fear
Mm-hmm.
that really plays a huge role in our electoral politics. And it's a fear that compromises the well-being of communities of color.
Right. And I think, Brian, I just want to say you touched on one of the things that's become one of the most frustrating things this past, of the many frustrating things, when people talk about, oh, how could you be violent towards St. Pat? How could you desecrate these buildings? And I'm like, these are inanimate objects. We need to be outraged more. Well, not we, white Americans need to be more outraged at the violence that's being inflicted on Black and brown men and women in this country, and not just these buildings that, yes, I understand why they're significant to our church, but the outrage and the fear needs to be changed to, oh, let's be just as mad as we were at St. Pat's getting spray painted as we are about Breonna Taylor. Like, let's be vocal about the things that are actual instances of violence.
Exactly, yeah. And the other thing, it gets us to a conversation, but I get frustrated with people who say, there are better, more effective, more just ways of making your point.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to say, okay, yes, as a good Catholic, I would say, yes, of course there are, but okay, tell me what they are.
Mm-hmm.
Because we as persons of color, we have marched, we have demonstrated, we have petitioned, we've boycotted, we've voted, we've written op-eds, we've bled, we've prayed, we've begged, we've pleaded, and we've done that for years, for decades, for centuries, and still we're in a country where a Black man can't go jogging without being stalked and killed. And so my point is that when we create a country where people despair because they don't see the political will to act on their legitimate grievances, and let's be clear here, the white will to act on their legitimate grievances,
Mm-hmm.
then we cannot be surprised when people see violence as, an attractive option.
Mm-hmm.
So don't tell me that there are just ways or better ways, more effective ways, or more ethical ways, unless you tell me what they are. Because we've done all of that. We've done all of that.
Mm-hmm.
As Martin Luther King said, riots are the language of the unheard.
Mm-hmm.
That when people do all of this, when they engage in nonviolent resistance and nonviolent protest over and over and over, year after year and decade after decade, and this is what we have to show for it. So I think that's a very, kind of frankly, a cheap, sermonizing that comes from, well-meaning white progressive liberals and Christians. But again, I just get very frustrated because they presume that we have not been doing these things. And we have for centuries. So if you're going to tell me that there's a better way or a more effective way, and I don't see it as advocating violence. I mean, don't do that. Don't say that, because I can hear the letters coming to the email saying that I said that. That's a lie. What I'm saying is that when you don't have the white will to act on these legitimate grievances, then we cannot be surprised when communities see violence as being an attractive option. So I want people to struggle with that question because it's a real one.
Yeah, and I could be getting this wrong. Correct me if I'm not right, but does King address that in a letter from the Birmingham jail where he talks about the white moderate, the biggest challenge he saw was the white moderates' commitment to
They're more
security.
concerned about order than which is the absence of tension, than to justice, which is the presence of justice. Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we need to be sitting with, particularly in this moment. I really wish we could go on another hour because this is a great conversation, and I'm learning so much. But we are at time, I want to thank both of you for, what you've been doing and what you've been doing for so long, and what I know you will continue to do. I mean, speaking personally, you both really inspire me and you educate me, so I'm grateful for that. And also thank you for taking some time out of your day to be in conversation with me. I'm really honored that you did that.
Well, thank you, John. Appreciate the work you're doing, and thank you for providing this forum to amplify our voices, and not just our voices, but amplify an invitation, a summons to proactive solidarity, and to see this as an expression of Christian faith and what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ in 2020.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Thanks to you both. And again, apologies for the video technical snafus. Next time I hope I'll be able to see you. And thanks for all of you who tuned in today. Faith in Public Life will continue to have these kind of conversations, even though we can't be together physically as much as we would like right now. We really are committed to having this dialogue online. So please stay tuned for more discussions to come. Thanks to all of you, and have a good day.
Okay. Bye, John. See you, Olga.
Bye to you both.
See you, Brian. See you, John.